Hi everyone, so welcome to another methods video. Again, please make sure, as with all the other videos, that you are very consistent in your note taking and you're very thorough. Remember, methods, or theory and methods as it's also known, will be on paper 1 and paper 3. Okay, so please pay close attention. So in today's session, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at what sociological researchers have to think about when they do research. So, what kind of things do they have to consider? And this falls into three main areas. Obviously, you have the advantage to pause, rewind, etc. So, let's look at these. So, sociological researchers have to think about practical considerations, ethical considerations, and theoretical considerations. The best way to remember it as PET. That's the best way to remember it, okay? Now, this here will prove really useful when it comes to essay structure for some kinds of methods questions. We've not looked at them yet, but it will definitely prove useful. So, learn it as PET, okay? That's the best way to remember it. Some of what we've covered in today's session, we will be covering in today's session, should I say. We've looked at time and again, some of it's brand new, so be very, very thorough. Okay, so here we go. What I've done is I've color coded the slides into different sections. So practical will be one, ethical will be one, and theoretical will be another. And then we've got a case study we could potentially use for AO2 at the end as well. So let's have a look at practical considerations first of all. So there are various practical considerations. As I've said, we've looked at some before. Some might be sound new, so please pay close attention. So cost. So sociological researchers would have to look at how expensive research is likely to be. So you'd have to factor in things like transportation costs, training of your researchers, postage costs, etc., etc. So researchers have to think about all of those things. Time, how long will the research take to conduct? How long will it take to analyse your findings? Qualitative data is likely to take much longer to analyse because it's not going to be pre-coded in terms of like pre-coded questions, etc. There's a key word here that I want you to remember: longitudinal, which will come up very shortly. Longitudinal, as in LONGITUDINAL, longitudinal research. That takes a very long time to conduct. Now, that's where researchers research a target population over many months or many years. Okay, so longitudinal research, and that's obviously going to take a long time to conduct, and the findings will take a long time to analyze as well. Okay, now funding. Now, this is a big one. So, who's going to pay for your research? Okay, now if you can get research funding very easily, then it's fine. If not, you might have to actually go for a much cheaper method. So interviews might be too expensive, so you might have to opt for questionnaires instead, especially questionnaires which mainly use pre-coded questions because they're likely to be much cheaper to kind of print out, to analyze the findings, etc. Okay? Now, some types of funding you can actually get from governmental departments, especially if those departments can take advantage of your findings, as in they can use their findings, use your findings even. So that's one kind of funding source. Okay, as I said, if a study is going to be longitudinal, as in it's conducted over a lengthy period of time, you will have to get a significant amount of money to conduct that research, and it will have to be sustainable. What I mean by sustainable is that funding will have to last the duration of that study and perhaps longer, because it might take you a long time to analyze those findings. Okay, now some organizations are going to be exceptionally reluctant to fund certain kinds of research. So I've got an example for you here. So capitalist businesses, who are obviously driven by profit, they aren't going to be very happy to fund pro-Marxist research, because remember, pro-Marxists are very against the idea of capitalism. Okay, so that's what you'd have to think of as well. Now, this one we've looked at before, so let's just go back into it, but let's add some more detail if we need to. So, accessing the target population. Now, some groups can be exceptionally difficult to access. So, vulnerable groups, you might have to negotiate with a gatekeeper. So, say you're researching in a school, you might have to research pupils. You'll have to get past the gatekeeper being kind of the governors, the head teacher, the parents, etc. Okay, because vulnerable people often have several layers of kind of protection in terms of people that you have to get the research approved by before you can gain access. Okay, groups with poor literacy skills, you may have to interview them instead of using questionnaires. So, say you're doing research on parents who have got low literacy levels, use this as an example so you remember it. You might have to interview them rather than sending questionnaires out because they might not have the ability to complete the questionnaire. Obviously, the AO3 is that would push your cost up and your time up. Okay, if a target population lives in an extremely remote area, they are going to be incredibly difficult to access, or it might cost you more to access them. Lastly, deviant communities are going to be extremely reluctant to allow anyone in. So, say you were researching on the topic of sort of drug cartels or drug dealing, as some researchers have done in the past, they aren't very likely to allow people in. So people obviously conduct covert research, covert observation. The AO3, it pushes time and it pushes costs up again. Okay, so let's move on. Right, the size of the research team. So if you have a very small research team, you are only going to be able to conduct small scale research. Okay, well, not only, it's going to be more likely that you will only be able to conduct small scale research. So a person of one isn't going to be able to kind of do interviews with 5,000 people. So you have to consider those factors as well. Okay, so if you are a small research team, you might have to use questionnaires instead of interviewing a large sample. Okay. Now, different perspectives. Okay, so the political position that a theoretical perspective adopts or takes, it can actually impact the amount of funding it gets. So, as I said, if your research is taking a Marxist perspective, it's going to be really difficult to get funding from capitalist governments. Okay. Now, specialist skills, we've touched on this one before as well. So a researcher might need to invest a lot of time, a lot of money into developing knowledge or skills to conduct certain kinds of research on their target population. So we've looked at this before with Griffin's Black Like Me study. Griffin had to spend considerable time and money, investing considerable time and money into altering his appearance, learning language styles of his target population, etc. Okay, obviously that pushes time invested up and money invested up as well. Okay, personal values of a researcher. Okay, now researchers will tend to focus on research which fits with their personal beliefs. So Marxists and feminists are likely to conduct research which will try to bring about significant political changes. Okay, so those are some practical considerations. Now, moving on, obviously you can pause and rewind here. PowerPoint background has changed, so we're now looking at ethical considerations. Right, very important point here, we've touched on this before. All research that is conducted must follow the Code of Conduct, which is laid out by the British Sociological Association. You'll remember them as the BSA. We've looked at them before when we looked at observations. Okay, so informed consent. Whenever you conduct research, your participants must be fully knowledgeable about the purpose of the research being conducted. They must know exactly why you're doing the research. They must have the right to withdraw their consent. So if they're happy to contribute to your research, they must also know that they can leave that research. They can withdraw their consent at any time. Okay, they must be able to walk away from the research at any time. If they start the study and say it's an interview, 20 minutes into the interview, they can leave, they can withdraw their consent, and there must be no negative repercussions for them. Okay, now even in covert observation where your participants do not know that they are being researched, remember the identity of the researcher is hidden. Okay, now the researcher must still protect the target population from serious harms. Okay, the BSA actually say that. So in covert observation, you can't give your participants consent, but you still have to ensure that your participants are protected from any serious harms. They mustn't come to any serious harm, and that's what the BSA actually state within their code of conduct. Okay, now confidentiality. Now, your participants obviously have personal details, names, addresses, etc. They must be anonymized. In any reports, any findings, they must be anonymized. Their details must not be there. They must not be traceable. So, the publication of any findings, all details must be anonymized. Right, even if a researcher is using secondary data, so here I'm talking official statistics, so like the British Crime Survey, for instance, or publication of GCSE results that the governments do. If a researcher is using secondary data and in the secondary data there are details of people, the researcher still has to be very vigilant, very careful not to publish any participants' names in any reports they may write based on that secondary data. Okay? So, key point, everything has to be anonymized. Now, even in a longitudinal study, so say you're researching a particular group, you cannot publish those details of the names of the people. You've got to keep everything very much anonymized. Okay, so let's look at some more ethical considerations here. So, avoiding harm. No participant should ever be hurt or disadvantaged from your research. So that's physical, emotional, mental, etc. Again, the BSA state that. Okay, now when you're researching sensitive issues, so I've got an example here like poverty, or you're researching vulnerable groups like the homeless, you must take considerable care, put considerable effort in to making sure that you don't damage the self-esteem of the people you're researching, because you may have to ask them sensitive questions, but you should be very careful not to damage their self-esteem. You should not mock them, okay? So that's a really, really significant point. You shouldn't damage their self-esteem. Okay, now competence. Now, researchers should very much abide by laws. We call laws social policies within sociology. So, researchers should follow the Human Rights Act, the Data Protection Act, okay? Now, researchers must be very, very careful not to bring sociology into disrepute. Disrepute means you must not damage the name of sociology with your research. All research should be very reputable. It should be very moral. It should be as moral as possible, very ethical as possible. Okay, and you should be very, very mindful of any potential negative implications when you publish your research. So could your research, if you publish it, hurt a particular target population? You should be very mindful of that. You have to think about all of those factors. Okay, now violating privacy. Now, researchers should avoid getting too close to their participants. This can be quite difficult, especially in things like covert observation. If you do get too close to your participants, the AO3 of it is it can obviously impact validity of findings because you are getting too close and you might start to not see things as validly as you should. Okay, you should avoid violating the privacy of other people. Very much of your participants, you should not violate their privacy. Also, even with interpretivism, where the whole objective is to achieve Verstehen, researchers should not cross professional lines. You should not cross professional lines. It's very, very important not to cross professional lines. Okay, so moving on. Again, you can pause and rewind here. Let's look at theoretical considerations. So the colours changed on the background again. So this is the last part of the PET element. So theoretical considerations. We've looked at this before. So is there an agenda behind research? Okay, different theoretical perspectives will have a different agenda when they conduct research, okay? So remember that different theoretical perspectives will have a different agenda whenever they conduct research. So functionalists, we obviously know they take a consensus view, okay? They will conduct research which studies or shows that there is consensus in society that people are following a certain set of norms. So the theoretical perspective you take will often show that you have a different agenda behind your research. Okay, feminists and Marxists, they will conduct research which shows how damaging capitalism is or patriarchy is. Okay, so these are all examples for you. Let's look at some more theoretical considerations here. Okay, structural approaches. Make sure you've watched my video which I just posted previously on quantitative and qualitative data. Okay, so Structural approaches, they're often linked to the scientific or positivist way of doing research. Okay, now they argue that human behavior is affected by social forces. Again, look back at the previous video and your notes and you'll know exactly what that is. Okay, they take a top-down view that human behavior is impacted by forces. Okay, so women's behavior may be impacted by families, which are an institution, or patriarchy, again, which is a social force, so same thing. Okay, so positivist structural approaches are also called macro approaches. Okay, now what positivist structural approaches value? They value quantitative data, research high in reliability, research which is objective. Now, this is where the researcher's views or personal beliefs do not bias or prejudice the findings. Okay, where the researcher's views or their beliefs do not prejudice the findings. So you don't impact the way your research is being conducted because of your own personal beliefs, or you don't impact the findings because of your own personal beliefs. Okay? They generally value very highly representative and generalizable findings. Note generally here, okay? So as I've said, see the video on quantitative and qualitative research about which perspectives, so such as functionalists, whether they take a positivist, structural approach, etc. So look back at that video, okay? So these are theoretical considerations. So are you following a positivist way? If you do, you are going to take a top-down view. You're going to be a macro approach. You're going to focus on quantitative data, okay? So let's continue. So social action approaches, they are linked to Weber. Again, see the other video. Okay, social action approaches are commonly linked to interpretivism or the interpretivist approach. They are called micro theories or bottom-up theories. They argue we as actors each shape our own lives, not social forces. So we as actors shape our own lives and it's not social forces. Okay, they argue we all have free will. So our actions are voluntaristic, they are not determined. We shape our own lives. We can avoid social forces or they are not as impactful as, say, positivist or structural approaches argue. Okay, so they focus on qualitative data. They want highly valid results. They want to study meanings and motives behind human behavior. They want to uncover Verstehen. Okay, and they take a subjective approach. What I mean by subjective is they look at the individual. Okay, so they focus on the individual. What does this individual, how does this individual shape their own life? Okay, so they study each individual, okay, or each social group. Okay, so, but they, as I've said, when I mean subjective is they focus on that particular group or that particular person and their particular meanings and motives. That's what they want to uncover with their research. Okay, so let's look at a case study now. So the Moonies. Okay, so Barker, she studied a sect called the Moonies. Remember, we can use case studies as one type of AO2. We've got 3 that we can choose from at least. Okay, so background. Okay, so the research was welcomed by the Moonies because they were criticised for brainwashing or indoctrinating their members. Remember that term. Okay, now Barker's research, it was the Moonies agreed to take part because they wanted to kind of get rid of this accusation that they were brainwashing people. So, how Barker studied the Moonies. So she did this in 3 ways. First of all, she sent them a 40-page questionnaire to every couple, every Mooney couple in the UK. Okay, so that's what she did. Then she conducted between a 4 and an 8 hour in-depth interview with smaller samples of Mooney couples. Okay. Thirdly, she undertook participant observation. So she lived with them for 2 years. That, therefore, is a longitudinal study. Okay. That, therefore, is a longitudinal study. Okay, now, how did she analyse her results? So she compared her findings against the British population as a whole, as in general. So this helped her compare the characteristics of the Moonies, like their age, their gender, their social class. There's another term for that, social stratification, remember? So she compared the characteristics of the Moonies against the general population. Now, this is what she found. Okay, there was no brainwashing happening. Members of the sect were more likely to be middle class. and people joined them because it helped offer them meaning to their lives. Now, what can we say about her research? Okay, it uses multiple methods, triangulation. Okay, realists, not realists as in crime and deviance realists, this is different. So remember, look back at the previous video. They would approve of this as they like positivist structural methods, the questionnaire that she used, and then she followed that up with interpretivist or social action approaches, the interviews or the observation. Okay, so what this proves? It proves that it's very rare in modern research to use methods which only fit with one theoretical approach. Okay, as in positivism, interpretivism, structural social action. It's very rare to just use the one. Okay, modern research will generally use many methods which fit with both. Okay, that then satisfies goals of both positivists and interpretivists. Okay, so that's it for this video. Thank you very much for listening. Please make sure you're fully up to date with all your videos that I've been posting and all the notes as well. Thank you very much for listening.